In 1945, just months after the end of World War II, a team of archaeologists working in the ruins of ancient Nineveh made a discovery that would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about human history. Buried beneath layers of dust and rubble, they found a small clay tablet covered in cuneiform script. It looked unremarkable at first, just another piece of ancient Sumerian mathematics. But when scholars finally decoded what was written on that tablet, they froze in disbelief. The number inscribed on that piece of clay was 195,955,200,000,000, a 15-digit number so precise, so impossibly sophisticated, that it describes the exact relationship between lunar and solar cycles. This single calculation, carved into clay over 4,000 years ago, requires knowledge of astronomy that we did not rediscover until the age of supercomputers. But here is where it gets truly unsettling. To verify this number, to confirm its accuracy through observation alone, you would need to track the movements of celestial bodies for over 64,800 years. Think about that for a moment. The Sumerians appeared as a civilization around 3500 BC. They lasted roughly 2,000 years before fading into history. So how did they possess knowledge that required watching the skies for more than 60,000 years? This is not the only impossible thing the Sumerians knew. Their star charts accurately depicted planets that cannot be seen with the naked eye. Uranus was not officially discovered until 1781. Neptune was not found until 1846. Yet Sumerian cylinder seals show a complete solar system, including these distant worlds, carved in stone thousands of years before telescopes existed. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, a wobble in Earth's rotation that takes 25,920 years to complete one cycle. Modern science only confirmed this phenomenon in the 20th century, yet the Sumerians not only knew about it, they measured it with stunning accuracy. They understood that Earth was round and spinning through space, at a time when most civilizations believed the world was flat. They documented the exact length of a year down to a precision that rivals our modern calculations. They mapped the stars with a sophistication that would not be matched again until the Renaissance. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they claimed that all of this knowledge was given to them by beings who came from the stars. The Sumerians are widely recognized as the world's first civilization. They gave us the first written language, the first cities, the first laws, the first schools, the first literature. Everything that defines human civilization begins with them. But unlike every other culture in human history, the Sumerians did not evolve gradually. They appeared suddenly, fully formed, with technologies and knowledge that took the rest of humanity thousands of years to redevelop. There are no primitive stages, no slow progression from simple to complex. One moment, there is nothing but scattered hunter-gatherers in Mesopotamia. The next moment, seemingly overnight in archaeological terms, there is Sumer, complete with writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, government, and technology that would not be surpassed for millennia. Hey everyone, this is Mr. H, and welcome back to the channel. If you are fascinated by ancient mysteries and the unexplained chapters of human history, you are definitely in the right place. We are about to dive deep into one of the greatest enigmas of all time, the Sumerians and their impossible knowledge. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this journey is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about where we came from. Trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next. Now, the question that archaeologists, historians, and researchers have been wrestling with for over a century is this: how? How could the first civilization on Earth possess knowledge that seems to come from nowhere? Knowledge that, by all logic, they should not have had access to. Knowledge that suggests either an unbroken chain of observation spanning tens of thousands of years, or something far stranger. Something that most academics refuse to even consider. The possibility that someone, or something, gave them this information. The Sumerians themselves had an answer to this question. They wrote it down, carved it in stone, and left it for us to find. They said their knowledge came from the ANUNNAKI, the ones who came down from heaven to earth. Here is something that should be impossible. In the archaeological record of human development, We see a clear pattern everywhere we look. Humans start simple. Stone tools give way to bronze. Mud huts evolve into brick buildings. Pictograms slowly develop into written language. This progression takes thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years. It is gradual, messy, full of false starts and dead ends. This is how civilizations are born. Except in Sumer, around 3500 BC, in the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something unprecedented happened. A complete, sophisticated civilization materialized seemingly out of thin air. And when I say complete, I mean every single marker of advanced society appeared simultaneously. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, complex architecture, organized religion, legal codes, educational systems, agricultural technique, metallurgy, wheel technology, all of it, at once. Imagine you are an archaeologist digging through layers of earth in southern Iraq. You are moving through time in reverse. You find ruins from 1800 BC. Below that, structures from 2500 BC. You keep digging, going deeper, expecting to find simpler and simpler remains, cruder pottery, more primitive tools, evidence of gradual development. But that is not what you find. Instead, you hit 3500 BC, and suddenly there is everything. Elaborate temples dedicated to a complex pantheon of gods, multi-story ziggurats built with precise measurements, thousands of clay tablets covered in sophisticated cuneiform script, discussing everything from astronomy to poetry to business contracts, intricate cylinder seals depicting detailed mythological scenes, advanced irrigation systems that transformed desert into farmland, cities laid out in organized grids with public buildings, residential areas, and infrastructure. And then, just before 3500 BC, there is almost nothing. Scattered settlements, simple pottery, basic stone tools. The contrast is not gradual. It is a cliff edge. On one side, you have essentially Stone Age culture. On the other, you have civilization. Dr. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the world's leading experts on Sumer, called this "History Begins at Sumer." He catalogued 39 firsts, attributed to Sumerian civilization. The first schools, the first bicameral congress, the first historian, the first pharmacopoeia, the first legal precedents, the first library catalogue, the first moral ideals. The list goes on and on. But Kramer, like most mainstream scholars, never adequately explained where all of this came from. Compare this to Egypt, often held up as humanity's other great ancient civilization. Egyptian culture shows clear developmental stages. We can trace the evolution from pre-dynastic period through the early dynastic period into the Old Kingdom. We see pottery styles change gradually. Burial practices evolve slowly. Writing develops from simple symbols to more complex hieroglyphics over centuries. Egypt makes sense archaeologically. Sumer does not. The same is true for ancient China, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, every other civilization on Earth. They all show their work, so to speak. They all have a developmental timeline that we can follow, but Sumer appears to have skipped this entire process. It is as if someone handed them a complete instruction manual for civilization and said, "Here you go, get started." The Sumerian language itself deepens this mystery. It is what linguists call a language isolate. This means it has no known relatives, no linguistic family tree, no clear connection to any other language on Earth. Most languages can be traced back to common roots. English, German, French, Spanish, Hindi, Persian, they all descend from Proto, Indo, European, Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic, share Semitic origins. But Sumerian, it stands alone. It has no ancestors, no cousins, no evolutionary path. It simply exists, fully formed, with a complex grammar and extensive vocabulary from its very first appearance. Their writing system, cuneiform, presents the same puzzle. Yes, we can see some development from earlier pictographic symbols to the wedge-shaped signs pressed into clay tablets. But this transition happens remarkably fast. within just a few hundred years. And from the very beginning, cuneiform was being used to record complex ideas. We are not talking about simple inventory lists, though those exist too. We are talking about legal codes, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, epic poetry, and detailed mythological narratives. Right from the start, the Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2100 BC, is the oldest known law code, predating Hammurabi's more famous laws by 300 years. But what is striking is not just its age, it is its sophistication. These are not crude rules scratched in stone. This is a comprehensive legal framework, with specific punishments calibrated to specific crimes, concepts of justice and fairness, and an organized societal structure that requires a high level of abstract thinking. Sumerian mathematics was based on a sexagesimal system, meaning base 60 instead of our base 10. This is an odd choice for a civilization just starting out. Base 10 makes intuitive sense because we have 10 fingers. But base 60? That requires a level of mathematical abstraction that seems out of place for humanity's first civilization. Yet this system was so effective that we still use it today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are Sumerian inheritances, embedded so deeply in our culture that we never question them. Their architectural achievements are equally baffling. The ziggurat at Ur, built around 2100 BC, stands over 70 feet tall and was constructed with millions of mud bricks, many of which were stamped with the name of the king who commissioned it. The mathematics required to build such a structure, to ensure it would not collapse under its own weight, to calculate the precise angles and load-bearing capacities, speaks to an engineering knowledge that should have taken centuries to develop. Yet the Sumerians were building ziggurats within a few hundred years of their appearance as a civilization. They had a numerical system that could express numbers in the millions. They understood fractions, including complex ones. They solved quadratic equations. They calculated the area of irregular shapes. They understood geometric progressions. The famous Plimpton 322 tablet, dating to around 1800 BC, contains what are essentially Pythagorean triples, demonstrating knowledge of this mathematical relationship more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born in Greece. Then there is their astronomy, which we will explore in depth later, but it bears mentioning here because it is part of this larger pattern of impossible advancement. The Sumerians did not just observe the stars casually, they maintained detailed records. They predicted eclipses. They tracked planetary movements with precision. They divided the sky into constellations, many of which we still recognize today. This level of astronomical sophistication requires generations of careful observation, mathematical calculation, and record-keeping. Yet the Sumerians seem to have had all of this from the very beginning. So what is the explanation? Mainstream archaeology typically offers one of two answers. The first is that we simply have not found the evidence yet for gradual development. Perhaps there were earlier settlements that showed this progression, but they have been destroyed by flooding, erosion, or the passage of time. The Mesopotamian floodplain is notoriously difficult for archaeological preservation. Maybe the developmental stages are buried under meters of silt, waiting to be discovered. The second explanation is that Sumer was not actually the first, but rather the inheritor of knowledge from earlier cultures we do not fully understand yet. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BC, represents an earlier sophisticated culture that somehow passed knowledge forward. Perhaps there were other civilizations that rose and fell before recorded history, leaving only fragments of their achievements. But here is the problem with both explanations. We have now been excavating Mesopotamia for over 150 years. We have dug extensively throughout the region. We have found countless sites, countless artifacts, countless tablets, and yet the pattern remains the same. Sumer appears suddenly, fully formed, without precedent. At some point, the absence of evidence starts to become evidence of absence. The Sumerians themselves offered a different explanation. According to their own records, their own mythology, their own sacred texts, they did not develop this knowledge slowly. It was given to them by the Anunnaki, by beings who descended from the heavens. and taught humanity the arts of civilization. In Sumerian texts, this transfer of knowledge is not metaphorical. It is described as literal, historical fact. The gods came down. The gods taught humans. The gods established the first cities. The gods gave humanity the tools of civilization. And then, after a time, the gods left. For most of modern history, scholars have dismissed these accounts as mythology, as primitive attempts to explain the world through supernatural stories. But as we continue to uncover more about Sumer, as we decode more tablets and analyze more artifacts, a disturbing question keeps emerging. What if they were not speaking metaphorically? What if they were describing something that actually happened? By the way, I am curious. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop your location and the time in the comments. I always find it fascinating to see how this community spans the entire globe. People from different time zones all asking the same questions about our mysterious past. Whether it is 3 a.m. in Tokyo or noon in New York, we are all connected by these ancient mysteries. Let me tell you about a clay tablet that sat in the basement of the British Museum for decades. Nobody paid much attention to it. Just another artifact from ancient Mesopotamia, catalogued and filed away. Until one day in the 1970s, a researcher named Maurice Chatelain decided to actually look at the numbers carved into its surface. What he found changed everything. The tablet contained a calculation, a single number, 195,955,200,000,000. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that is a big number, so what? Here is the so what. When Chatelain ran this number through modern computers, testing it against every astronomical cycle we know, he discovered something extraordinary. This number perfectly represents the relationship between lunar and solar cycles. It is what is known as a constant, a fundamental ratio that governs how the moon and sun move relative to each other. But the deeper you dig into this number, the more impossible it becomes. To arrive at this constant through observation alone, you would need to meticulously track the movements of the moon and sun for exactly 64,800 years. Not approximately, exactly. The math does not work any other way. You cannot shortcut this calculation. You cannot guess your way to this level of precision. You have to watch, record, measure, and calculate for millennia upon millennia. The Sumerian civilization lasted roughly 2,000 years. Even if we are generous and assume they inherited knowledge from earlier cultures, we are still nowhere close to 64,000 years of continuous astronomical observation. So where did this number come from? Who watched the skies for that long? And more importantly, why does a civilization that supposedly just invented writing need a 15-digit astronomical constant? This is not an isolated anomaly. The Sumerians knew things about our solar system that they had absolutely no business knowing. Let me be specific about this, because it is not just impressive, it is impossible according to everything we understand about the development of astronomy. They knew about Uranus. Now, Uranus is barely visible to the naked eye under perfect conditions, and even then, it looks like a dim star. No ancient civilization should have identified it as a planet. We did not officially discover Uranus until 1781, when William Herschel spotted it through a telescope. Yet, Sumerian texts and cylinder seals describe a planetary system that includes bodies beyond Saturn. Neptune is even more ridiculous. Neptune is completely invisible without a telescope. There is no scenario, no perfect night, no ideal conditions where a human being can see Neptune with just their eyes. It was discovered in 1846 through mathematical predictions before it was ever visually confirmed. The calculations that led to its discovery were some of the most sophisticated mathematical astronomy ever attempted. Yet the Sumerians seem to have known it was there. The most famous piece of evidence for this is the VA-243 cylinder seal, currently held in the Berlin Museum. This small stone cylinder, no bigger than your fist, shows what appears to be a star surrounded by 11 smaller spheres. Conventional archaeologists claim it is just a stylized star pattern, nothing more. But researchers like Zecharia Sitchin have argued that it is a diagram of our solar system, complete with all the planets, including ones we did not discover until the modern era. The mainstream pushback against this interpretation is fierce. They point out that identifying planetary bodies on a 4,000-year-old seal is subjective, that ancient artists were not necessarily creating accurate astronomical diagrams, that we are seeing what we want to see. And you know what? That is a fair criticism. The cylinder seal alone is not conclusive, but it is not alone. It is part of a much larger pattern. Sumerian astronomy was absurdly advanced in ways that go far beyond debatable cylinder seals. They divided the sky into 12 sections, creating the zodiac that we still use today. They identified 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and tracked their movements with remarkable precision. They understood that planets moved differently than stars. They knew planets sometimes appeared to move backward in the sky, what we call retrograde motion, and they recorded these events systematically. They mapped constellations and gave them names, many of which survived through Babylonian astronomy into Greek astronomy and eventually into the star charts we use in the 21st century. When you look up at the night sky and see Leo or Taurus or Scorpio, you are seeing constellations that were named thousands of years ago in ancient Sumer. But here is where it gets truly strange. The Sumerians understood the precession of the equinoxes. This is a slow wobble in Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. Because of this wobble, the position of stars appears to shift very slowly over centuries. The effect is so gradual that you would not notice it in a single lifetime, or even in 10 lifetimes. You would need to maintain continuous astronomical records for thousands of years to even detect that this precession was happening, let alone measure it accurately. Modern astronomy only confirmed the precession of the equinoxes in the 20th century. The ancient Greeks suspected it might be happening. Hipparchus, around 120 BC, was the first to propose it, based on comparing old Babylonian star charts to his own observations. But even he could not measure it precisely because the timescales involved were too vast. Yet somehow, the Sumerians not only knew about precession, they calculated its rate with stunning accuracy. How is that possible? Even if we assume an unbroken chain of Sumerian astronomers watching the sky every single night for the entire duration of their civilization, 2,000 years is not enough, not even close. You would need at least 10 times that length of continuous observation to nail down precession with the precision they achieved. Then there is the question of their calendars. The Sumerians used a complex lunisolar calendar that required sophisticated mathematical adjustments to keep lunar months aligned with the solar year. They knew that 12 lunar months equal 354 days, falling short of the solar year by about 11 days. So they added intercalary months, extra months inserted at specific intervals to keep everything synchronized. This is not simple arithmetic. This requires understanding the deep mathematical relationship between lunar and solar cycles, which brings us right back to that impossible Nineveh constant. They measured the length of a year as 365.2422 days. Our modern measurement, using satellites and atomic clocks, calculates it as 365.24219 days. They were off by less than 3 minutes. Think about that. A civilization using nothing but naked eye observations and clay tablets calculated the length of a year to within 3 minutes of our laser-precise modern value. Their astronomical tables predicted eclipses, not just randomly, but systematically. They knew that eclipses followed patterns, what we now call the Saros cycle, an 18-year, 11-day, 8-hour period after which eclipses repeat. Predicting eclipses requires understanding the complex orbital mechanics of the Earth-Moon-Sun system. It requires vast amounts of observational data. Yet the Sumerians had it figured out. Now, let me bring up something that makes a lot of academics extremely uncomfortable. The Sumerians described a planet they called Nibiru. In their cosmology, Nibiru was a large planetary body with an extremely long orbital period, sometimes described as 3,600 years. They claimed this planet passed through the inner solar system periodically, and that it was the home of the Anunnaki, the gods who came to Earth. For decades, this was dismissed as pure mythology, Just another ancient culture creating stories about gods in the sky. But then, starting in the early 2000s, something interesting began happening. Astronomers started noticing weird gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system. The orbits of distant objects were not behaving the way they should. Something massive seemed to be influencing them. In 2016, researchers at Caltech published a paper proposing the existence of what they called Planet 9. A large planet, perhaps 10 times the mass of Earth, orbiting far beyond Neptune with an orbital period of 10 to 20,000 years. This planet has not been directly observed yet, but the mathematical evidence for its existence is compelling. Multiple trans-Neptunian objects have orbits that seem to be shepherded by something big out there. Now, is Planet 9 the same as Nibiru? Probably not. The orbital periods do not match, and the Caltech researchers are talking about something much farther out than what the Sumerians described. But here is what is unsettling. The Sumerians insisted there was another significant planetary body in our solar system. Modern astronomers mocked this idea for a century. And now, those same astronomers are saying, wait, there actually might be another planet out there. The Sumerians also claimed their astronomical knowledge came directly from the Anunnaki. They did not develop it themselves through patient observation. It was taught to them, given to them, downloaded, if you want to use a modern term. In text after text, we see the same theme. The gods descended. The gods taught humanity the secrets of the heavens. The gods established the foundations of astronomy and mathematics. One of the most important Sumerian deities was Enki, described as the god of wisdom and knowledge. According to mythology, Enki possessed something called the Me, pronounced May, which were essentially divine decrees or fundamental concepts that governed reality. Among these, Me were the secrets of astronomy, mathematics, and timekeeping. Enki was said to have shared some of these Me with humanity, lifting them from ignorance into civilization. Is this just mythology? Maybe. Probably, according to mainstream thought. But mythology usually contains kernels of truth, distorted memories of real events wrapped in symbolic language. When a culture consistently claims their knowledge came from an external source, from teachers who came from the sky, at what point do we at least consider the possibility that they are describing something real? The James Webb Space Telescope is currently scanning the outer solar system with unprecedented precision. If Planet 9 exists, we might finally see it within the next decade. And if we do, if we confirm there is indeed another large planet in an elliptical orbit beyond Neptune, we will have to ask ourselves a very uncomfortable question. How did the Sumerians know? How did people using clay tablets and reed styluses know something that took us supercomputers and space telescopes to discover? What were they really looking at when they carved those star charts in stone? And who taught them to look? The word appears hundreds of times across thousands of clay tablets. Anunnaki. To most people, it sounds like something from science fiction. But to the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were as real as the Tigris River. They were not abstract concepts or symbolic representations of natural forces. They were physical beings with names, personalities, families, conflicts, and most importantly, they were the reason humanity existed at all. Let me read you something directly from the Sumerian texts. This comes from a tablet known as the Atrahasis Epic, one of the oldest creation stories ever written. It describes why the Anunnaki created humans. When the gods, instead of man, did the work and bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. The great Anunnaki made the lesser gods carry the workload sevenfold. Anu, their father, was king. Their counselor, warrior Enlil. Their chamberlain, Ninurta. Their canal controller, Ennugi. They took the box of lots and cast the lots. The gods made their divisions. Anu went up to the sky, and Enlil took the earth for his people. The bolt which bars the sea was assigned to far-sighted Enki. This is not vague religious poetry. This reads like a historical account. The text describes a labor dispute. The Anunnaki came to Earth to extract resources, specifically gold according to multiple texts. They did the mining themselves for a period of time, but the work was brutal. Eventually the worker gods rebelled. They went on strike. They refused to continue the back-breaking labor. So the ruling council of the Anunnaki, led by Anu, Enlil, and Enki, came up with a solution. Create a new species to do the work. Create humans. Now, before you dismiss this as ancient fantasy, stay with me because the details get disturbingly specific. The epic continues describing the creation process. Enki and the birth goddess, Nintu, mixed clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god. From this mixture, humans were fashioned. Clay and divine blood. Clay representing earthly material, biological matter, the physical component. Divine blood representing something else, a genetic component perhaps, something that separated this new creation from ordinary animals. Other texts elaborate on this process even further. The goddess Ninhursag, also called Nintu, is described as the chief medical officer of the Anunnaki. The tablets call her the Lady of Life. She presided over what the texts call the creation chamber, or the house of fashioning. Multiple passages describe her mixing materials, combining elements, conducting what sounds remarkably like genetic manipulation. One text specifically mentions that 14 birth goddesses were assembled, and from a single mixture, 7 males and 7 females were produced. Does that sound like mythology, or does it sound like cloning? The Sumerian language has a word, Adamu, which means earthling or one of earth. This is almost certainly the linguistic origin of Adam from the Genesis story in the Bible. But in the Sumerian version, Adamu is not the name of a single individual. It is a species designation. Humans, the created ones. The hybrid species, engineered by mixing earthly biology with Anunnaki genetics. Here is where it gets really interesting. Modern genetics has uncovered some puzzling facts about human evolution that do not quite fit the standard narrative. Human chromosome 2 is a fusion of 2 separate chromosomes that exist in other primates. This fusion appears to have happened relatively recently in evolutionary terms, and it is unique to humans. We also experienced a dramatic and rapid increase in brain size over a very short period, evolutionarily speaking. Our cognitive abilities exploded in ways that do not follow the normal pace of natural selection. We have what scientists call missing links, gaps in the fossil record, where we should see gradual transitions but instead see sudden jumps. I am not saying ancient aliens definitely filled those gaps, but I am saying the Sumerian texts describe a process that sounds an awful lot like genetic intervention. They claim humans were created by combining existing earthly creatures with something else, something from the Anunnaki, and our genetics do show signs of something unusual happening in our past. The pantheon of Anunnaki gods was extensive and complicated, but a few names appear over and over as the key players. Anu was the sky god, the king, the ultimate authority. He stayed mostly in the heavens, rarely visiting Earth directly. Enlil was the commander of Earth operations, the administrator, the one who enforced the rules. And Enki, also called Ea, was the scientist, the creator, the one who loved humanity and often protected us from Enlil's harsher judgments. The relationship between Enlil and Enki is particularly fascinating because it mirrors a conflict that runs throughout human mythology worldwide. Enlil saw humans as tools, workers, servants who should stay in their place. Enki saw humans as his children, beings with potential who deserved knowledge and freedom. In the Sumerian flood story, which predates the biblical Noah tale by at least 1,000 years, it is Enlil who decides to wipe out humanity with a great deluge, and it is Enki who secretly warns a human named Ziusudra, telling him to build a boat and save himself, his family, and the animals. Does this sound familiar? It should, because this exact narrative appears in Genesis, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Babylonian texts, in Greek mythology with Deucalion, in Hindu texts with Manu. The same story, over and over, across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. A great flood sent to destroy humanity. One man warned by a benevolent god. A boat built to preserve life. After the waters recede, humanity begins again. Zecharia Sitchin spent decades translating Sumerian texts and proposing a controversial theory. He argued that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth roughly 450,000 years ago. They needed gold to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. They established mining operations in Africa, where the oldest known gold mines in human history are located, some dating back over 100,000 years. When their workers rebelled, they genetically engineered humans by combining their DNA with that of Homo erectus, creating Homo sapiens as a hybrid species. Mainstream academia absolutely hates Sitchin's work. They claim his translations are incorrect, that he misunderstood Sumerian grammar, that he cherry-picked evidence to fit his theory. And you know what? Some of their criticisms are valid. Sitchin was not a trained linguist. He made mistakes. He interpreted some symbols in ways that professional Sumerologists reject. But here is what they cannot dismiss. The texts exist. The stories are there. The Sumerians absolutely did claim that beings from the sky created humans. They did describe advanced knowledge being given to humanity by these beings. They did draw clear distinctions between the Anunnaki and humans, treating the Anunnaki as a separate species with longer lifespans, greater knowledge, and advanced technology. Let me address the elephant in the room, the ancient astronaut hypothesis, the idea that Earth was visited by extraterrestrial beings in the distant past. This theory has been popularized, some would say sensationalized, by shows and books that often make wild claims with flimsy evidence. I get it. The topic has baggage. But strip away the sensationalism for a moment and look at what the Sumerians themselves recorded. They described the Anunnaki arriving in flying vehicles. The Sumerian word for these vehicles is often translated as sky chambers or boats of heaven. These vehicles descended in fire and smoke. They rose back into the sky. The gods traveled between Earth and the heavens regularly. Is this mythology? Or is it eyewitness description filtered through the limited technological vocabulary of an ancient culture? Cylinder seals depict figures wearing what look like wristwatches, carrying what appear to be handheld devices, dressed in clothing that looks nothing like typical Mesopotamian garments. One famous seal shows a figure who seems to be wearing a cone-shaped helmet with pipes or tubes extending from it. Another shows beings with wings, which mainstream scholars interpret as purely symbolic. But wings are also a pretty logical way for an ancient person to describe something that flies if they had no concept of engines or propulsion systems. The Anunnaki are consistently described as being taller than humans, more powerful, longer lived. Sumerian king lists record rulers before the Great Flood whose reigns lasted tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the reigns gradually decrease, dropping from thousands of years to hundreds, then eventually to normal human lifespans. One interpretation is that these early kings were Anunnaki or Anunnaki human hybrids, whose genetics gave them extended lifespans. As generations passed and the Anunnaki blood became more diluted, lifespans returned to normal human length. This same pattern appears in Genesis. The pre-flood patriarchs lived for centuries. Methuselah supposedly lived 969 years. Adam lived 930 years. Noah lived 950 years. Then after the flood, lifespans rapidly decrease. Abraham lived 175 years. Moses lived 120 years. By the time we get to King David, lifespans are down to 70 or 80 years. Normal human range. Is this just coincidence? Or are multiple cultures preserving a memory of something real? The biblical Nephilim, the giants mentioned in Genesis, are described as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The Hebrew word Nephilim literally means those who came down or the fallen ones. The sons of God in Hebrew is B'nai Elohim. Elohim is a plural word. It literally translates as gods, or those who came from the sky. The same beings, different language, same story. Every ancient culture on Earth has legends of gods descending from the heavens, interacting with humans, teaching civilization, and occasionally interbreeding with humanity to create hybrid bloodlines. Egypt had the Neteru, Greece had the Olympians, India had the Devas, Mesoamerica had Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, Polynesia had the Sky People. These are not vague spirits or abstract forces. They are described as physical beings with technology, knowledge, and power far beyond normal humans. So what do we do with all of this? We have three basic options. Option 1. It is all mythology, symbolic storytelling with no basis in physical reality. Option 2. It is distorted memory of natural events, primitive people misunderstanding natural phenomena and creating God stories to explain them. Option 3. Something actually happened. Beings with advanced knowledge and technology really did interact with early humans, and every culture on Earth preserved that memory in their myths and legends. I am not here to tell you which option is correct, but I am here to tell you that the Sumerians themselves had absolutely no doubt about which one they believed. They insisted this was history. They recorded names, dates, locations, genealogies, events. They built temples to these beings. They organized their entire civilization around the belief that the Anunnaki were real, had created humanity, and were still watching from the heavens. And if they were wrong, if it was all just made up, then we have to explain how the first civilization in human history created the most elaborate, most consistent, most detailed fictional universe ever conceived, 4,000 years before science fiction was even invented. Pick up your phone right now and look at the clock. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Now, open your compass app. 360 degrees in a circle. These numbers are so embedded in our daily lives that we never question them. But here is the thing. They make no logical sense. We use a base 10 counting system for everything else. 10 fingers, 10 digits, multiples of 10. So why not 10 seconds in a minute? Why not 100 degrees in a circle? The answer is simple and deeply strange, because over 4,000 years ago, the Sumerians decided otherwise, and their decision was so perfect, so mathematically elegant, that we never bothered to change it. Base 60. Sexagesimal mathematics. It sounds arbitrary until you actually understand what makes 60 special. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That is 12 different factors. Compare that to 100, which only has 9 factors, or 10, which only has 4. When you are doing astronomical calculations, when you are dividing circles, when you are measuring time, having a number with many factors makes everything cleaner. Fewer messy decimals, more elegant fractions. The Sumerians did not choose 60 randomly. They chose it because mathematically, it is superior for the kind of work they were doing. But this raises an obvious question. How did the first civilization on Earth figure this out? How did people who supposedly just learned to write decide that base 60 was the optimal mathematical system for complex calculations? This is not intuitive knowledge. This is the kind of insight you gain after centuries of mathematical experimentation. Yet the Sumerians were using base 60 from day one. In 1945, a mathematician named Otto Neugebauer was examining a clay tablet in Columbia University's collection. The tablet was labeled Plimpton 322, named after the collector who donated it. At first glance, it looked like a simple accounting record, just columns of numbers arranged in rows. But when Neugebauer actually analyzed those numbers, he realized he was looking at something impossible. The tablet contained 15 rows of Pythagorean triples, perfect sets of 3 numbers that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now here is the problem. This tablet dates to approximately 1800 BC. Pythagoras was not born until around 570 BC. The theorem that bears his name was supposedly discovered by him over 1,000 years after this tablet was created. Except clearly, the Sumerians already knew about it. Not only knew about it, but had systematically generated examples of it, organized them in a table, and were apparently teaching it as standard mathematics. But it gets weirder. These are not simple Pythagorean triples like 3, 4, 5. These are massive numbers. One row contains the triple 4,961, 6,480, 8,161. Another has 13,500, 12,709, 18,541. Generating numbers like this requires understanding quadratic equations. It requires sophisticated algebraic manipulation. It requires the kind of mathematical thinking that we associate with Renaissance Europe, not Bronze Age Mesopotamia, and they were doing this casually. This was not some advanced research document. Based on the formatting and context, Plimpton 322 was likely a teaching tool, a practice tablet for students learning mathematics, which means this level of mathematical sophistication was considered basic education in Sumerian schools. Think about what you learned in school at age 12 or 13. Now imagine if that curriculum included generating Pythagorean triples with 5-digit numbers using Babylonian sexagesimal notation. That is the level we are talking about. Their understanding of geometry was equally advanced. Clay tablets show calculations for the areas of circles, triangles, trapezoids, and irregular polygons. They understood that the area of a circle is pi times radius squared. Now, they did not have our precise value for pi. They approximated it as 3, which creates some error. But the fact that they understood the relationship at all, that they knew circular area required squaring the radius and multiplying by a constant, shows geometric insight that is supposed to belong to the Greeks 1,000 years later. They calculated volumes of three-dimensional objects: spheres, cylinders, cones, pyramids. One tablet shows the calculation for the volume of a frustum, which is a pyramid with the top cut off. This requires calculus-level thinking. You need to understand how volumes change as dimensions change. You need integration concepts, even if you do not have the formal notation. Yet here are the Sumerians, working through these problems with nothing but wet clay and a reed stylus. Division was not a problem for them despite working in base 60. They had tables of reciprocals, essentially early division charts. If you needed to divide by 7, you would look up the reciprocal of 7 and multiply instead. This is computationally identical to division and actually faster in many cases. It is the same principle computers use today. Modern processors convert division into multiplication whenever possible because multiplication is faster. The Sumerians figured this out 4,000 years ago. They understood square roots and cube roots. Multiple tablets show calculations extracting these roots for various numbers. They had algorithms, step-by-step procedures for finding roots to high precision. Again, this is not something you stumble upon accidentally. This requires generations of mathematical development and refinement. Or, if you believe the Sumerian texts themselves, it requires someone teaching you the shortcuts. Algebra was not just present in Sumerian mathematics. It was fundamental. They solved linear equations, quadratic equations, even some cubic equations. They understood variables, unknowns, the concept that you could manipulate symbols according to fixed rules to find solutions. One tablet presents a problem that translates roughly as, I multiplied length and width and got the area. Then I added length and width and got a certain sum. What are length and width? This is a system of equations. 2 unknowns, 2 equations. Standard algebra. In 1800 BC, they worked with geometric progressions and understood exponential growth. One famous problem involves a worker's pay doubling each day for 30 days. The question asks how much the worker earns total. This requires summing a geometric series, understanding that 2 to the power of 30 is over 1 billion in base 10. The Sumerians worked through this in base 60 and got the correct answer. Fractions were handled with ease, not just simple fractions like 1/2 or 1/3, but complex ones like 7/60ths or 13 3/600ths. They added fractions, subtracted fractions, multiplied fractions. They converted between different denominators. They understood that fractions were numbers just as valid as whole numbers, not something separate or special. Here is what really bothers mathematicians who study this material. Sumerian mathematics does not show development. There is no progression from simple to complex. The earliest tablets we have are already doing advanced work. It is as if someone handed them a complete mathematical system and said, here, use this. No rough drafts, no trial and error, no centuries of incremental improvement, just immediate, sophisticated, correct mathematics from the start. Compare this to how mathematics actually developed in other cultures. In Europe, it took over 1,000 years to go from Roman numerals to the adoption of Arabic numerals, another few centuries to develop algebra. Another few centuries to invent calculus. We can trace every step, every breakthrough, every wrong turn. With Sumer, there are no steps. There is just arrival. The French mathematician Georges Ifra spent decades studying the history of numbers and numerical systems worldwide. His conclusion about Sumerian mathematics was blunt. He said their system was so sophisticated, so well designed, so perfectly suited for advanced calculations, that it showed clear evidence of being created deliberately by highly intelligent minds who understood mathematics at a deep theoretical level. Not minds that were learning mathematics, minds that already knew it. When NASA was designing the guidance systems for the Apollo missions, they faced a problem. Computers of the 1960s were extremely limited in memory and processing power. They needed a mathematical system that was efficient, that minimized computational errors, that worked well with circular calculations and angular measurements. Engineers seriously considered switching to sexagesimal mathematics for the mission because it was superior to decimal for those specific tasks. They ultimately stuck with decimal for compatibility reasons, but the fact that Sumerian base 60 mathematics was even in the conversation for a moon mission tells you how good it really is. Every watch, every clock, every protractor, every astronomical calculation, every GPS coordinate on Earth uses Sumerian mathematics. We have sent probes to the edge of the solar system using time measurements invented in ancient Sumer. We have split atoms, built supercomputers, mapped the human genome, and through all of it, we are still using 60 seconds in a minute because the Sumerians got it right the first time. A civilization that supposedly just figured out how to write somehow created a mathematical framework so perfect that 4,000 years of human progress has not improved on it. That should be impossible. But the clay tablets do not lie. The numbers are there, and they are still correct. In 1936, workers building a railroad near Baghdad broke through into an ancient burial site. Among the pottery and bones, they found something that made absolutely no sense. A clay jar about 5 inches tall. Inside the jar was a copper cylinder. Inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod suspended by an asphalt seal that prevented it from touching the copper. When archaeologists tested the design, they realized what they were looking at. It was a battery, a functioning electrochemical cell capable of generating over 1 volt of electricity, and it was 2,000 years old. Now, before you start thinking this is some fringe theory, understand that multiple scientists have replicated this design. They filled similar jars with acidic liquids like vinegar or wine, inserted the copper and iron components exactly as found, and measured electrical current. It works. The Baghdad battery, as it is now called, produces electricity. The question nobody can answer is why. What were people in ancient Mesopotamia doing with electricity? The standard explanation is electroplating. Perhaps ancient jewelers used these batteries to coat objects with thin layers of gold or silver. Some artifacts from the region do show evidence of electroplating, a process that requires electrical current. But here is the thing. We have never found any Mesopotamian texts describing this process. No instructions, no references, no acknowledgement that they were even doing it. The knowledge appears, gets used, and then vanishes without documentation. That pattern should sound familiar by now. But the Baghdad battery is just the beginning. Walk through any major museum with Mesopotamian artifacts and pay attention to the stonework. Not the clay tablets or pottery, but the stone. Specifically, look at the precision. There are cylinder seals carved from extremely hard stones like hematite and lapis lazuli, with details so fine they require magnification to fully appreciate. We are talking about engravings less than a millimeter wide, perfectly executed, on materials that rank 7 or higher on the Mohs hardness scale. Try to carve hematite with a copper tool. Go ahead. I will wait. Copper is softer than hematite. It will not work. Bronze is only slightly better. You need steel tools, or diamond bits, or some kind of abrasive technology that can handle extremely hard stone. The Sumerians supposedly had copper and bronze. So how were they carving hematite with microscopic precision? The same question applies to their drilling capabilities. Sumerian artifacts include stone vessels with perfectly circular drill holes, not rough holes that were gradually ground out. Clean, precise, circular holes that required rotary drilling technology. Some of these holes are in stones like diorite, which is incredibly hard and brittle. Drilling diorite without modern tools is nearly impossible. It cracks. It shatters. Yet Sumerian craftsmen were drilling it routinely. Archaeologists will tell you they used bow drills with sand as an abrasive. Maybe, but try it yourself and see how long it takes to drill through a piece of diorite with a bow drill and sand. Hours and hours of work for a single hole. And that is assuming you have the technique perfected. The Sumerians were producing these objects in quantities that suggest efficient, rapid production, which means either they had workshops full of people spending their entire lives drilling holes, or they had better tools than we think. Then there is the metallurgy. The Sumerians were working with bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin. But here is what is strange. Tin is relatively rare in Mesopotamia. The nearest major tin sources are in Afghanistan, over 1,000 miles away. Yet Sumerian bronze work appears very early in their civilization, which means they had established long-distance trade routes almost immediately. They were importing raw materials from distant regions, smelting them, alloying them in precise ratios, and producing tools and weapons. This is not simple metalworking. This is industrial-scale production that requires extensive knowledge of metallurgy, chemistry, and trade logistics. They also produced electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, except the ratios in Sumerian electrum are too consistent to be natural. They were deliberately creating specific gold to silver ratios, which means they understood alloy properties and could control their smelting processes with precision. Why would you need precise gold to silver ratios unless you understood that different ratios have different properties? That is materials science. That is engineering knowledge. Now let me show you something really strange. Look at Sumerian relief carvings, especially those depicting the Anunnaki gods. Notice anything they are all carrying? There is an object that appears over and over again, a small handbag or bucket-like container. Every single depiction of the Anunnaki shows them holding this object. Sometimes it is in their right hand, sometimes their left, but it is always there. Here is where it gets weird. This same handbag symbol appears in Turkey at Göbekli Tepe, dated to 9600 BC. It appears in Egypt held by gods in temple carvings. It appears in Mesoamerica, carried by Olmec and Mayan deities. It appears in Indonesia at Gunung Padang. It appears on Easter Island. Same object, same design, same way of being held. Across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all depicting their gods or advanced ancestors carrying this mysterious container. What is in the handbag? Nobody knows. Some researchers think it is symbolic, representing wisdom or divine knowledge. Others propose it is technological, perhaps a power source or communication device. The Sumerians themselves never explained it in their texts. It simply appears in the art as something important, something the gods always had with them. The fact that this exact symbol shows up in cultures that supposedly had zero contact with each other is one of those things that makes diffusionist theories look a lot more reasonable. Sumerian architecture presents its own mysteries. The ziggurats are impressive enough. Massive stepped pyramids, built with millions of mud bricks. But look closer at the engineering. These structures were built on the Mesopotamian floodplain, which has unstable soil. Building anything tall and heavy on this kind of ground is a nightmare. Modern engineers know that you need deep foundations, drainage systems, and carefully designed load distribution. The Sumerians somehow figured this out, without modern soil analysis or structural engineering equations. The ziggurat at Ur has survived for over 4,000 years in an earthquake-prone region with seasonal flooding. It is still standing. Many modern buildings in the same area have not lasted a century. What did the Sumerians know about structural engineering that allowed their buildings to outlast modern construction? They did not have steel reinforcement. They did not have concrete. They had mud bricks and bitumen. Yet their structures have endured while modern buildings crumble. Their water management systems were equally sophisticated. They built extensive canal networks for irrigation, moving water across vast distances with careful attention to gradient and flow rate. They constructed aqueducts, drainage systems, and water storage facilities. Some Sumerian cities had what appear to be early sewage systems, channeling waste away from residential areas. This requires understanding of hydraulics, civil engineering, and public health, knowledge that supposedly took civilizations thousands of years to develop. There are also the mysterious burning mirrors mentioned in some texts, descriptions of devices that could concentrate sunlight to create intense heat. We know this technology is possible. The Greeks later developed burning mirrors used in warfare, but the Sumerian references suggest they had this knowledge much earlier. Were they using solar concentration for metalworking? For warfare? The texts are frustratingly vague. And then there are the star charts. Not just drawings of constellations, but detailed maps carved in stone showing precise stellar positions. Some of these charts are so accurate that modern astronomers can use them to date when they were created by calculating where those stars were positioned in the sky at different historical periods. The precision required to create these charts demands sophisticated observational tools, sighting instruments, angle measurement device, some kind of technology for recording, and comparing observations over time. There is a clay tablet sitting in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford that contains one of the most bizarre historical documents ever created. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it reads like someone's fantasy novel, except the Sumerians treated it as legitimate history. The document lists every ruler of Sumer from the beginning of kingship until around 1600 BC. It includes their names, their cities, and the length of their reigns. And this is where things get absolutely insane. The first king listed is Alulim of Eridu. His reign, 28,800 years. The second king, Alanga, also of Eridu, ruled for 36,000 years. Onmenluana of Bad Tibira comes in at 43,200 years. The list continues like this, cataloguing 8 kings before the Great Flood, with reigns ranging from 18,000 to 43,000 years each. Do the math. That is over 240,000 years of recorded kingship before the flood even happens. Now, your first reaction is probably the same as every mainstream archaeologist. This is mythology. These are symbolic numbers. Nobody actually believes these kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, except the document does not read like mythology. It reads like a straightforward historical chronicle. There are no epic battles described, no supernatural events detailed, just names, cities, and reign lengths presented in the exact same matter-of-fact style used for the historically verified later kings. The format never changes. The tone never shifts from historical record to mythological narrative. And here is what makes it even stranger. After the flood, the reigns suddenly become shorter, not by a little bit, dramatically shorter. The first post-flood king, Gushur of Kish, ruled for 1,200 years. Still impossible by our standards, but a huge drop from 43,000. The next few kings come in between 900 and 1,500 years. Then as you move forward through time, the numbers keep decreasing. By 2000 BC, the kings are ruling for 20, 30, maybe 50 years. Normal human lifespans. The list gradually transitions from the impossible to the plausible to the historically verified. It is almost like watching a slow genetic degradation play out over thousands of years. Multiple copies of this king list have been found, and they all contain basically the same information with only minor variations. This was not some fringe document. This was official history, copied and recopied by scribes, taught in schools, referenced in other texts. The Sumerians genuinely believed this chronology. They built their entire historical framework around it. So what are we supposed to do with this? The standard academic explanation is that these are not literal years, but rather represent dynasties or periods. Maybe Alulim was not a single person, but a dynasty of rulers whose combined reigns totaled 28,800 years. Or perhaps the numbers are symbolic, representing the importance or divine favor of each king rather than actual time. These are reasonable explanations. They make the king list digestible for modern sensibilities. But there is a problem with the dynasty explanation. The text specifically uses singular names and treats each entry as an individual ruler. It says, Alulim ruled 28,800 years. Not the Alulim dynasty ruled, or in the time of Alulim. The grammar is consistent throughout the entire document. If these were dynasties, you would expect different linguistic construction, but there is none. It is individual after individual after individual. The symbolic interpretation has the same issue. Why would the symbolism gradually decrease in such a precise mathematical pattern? If the numbers represented divine favor or mythological importance, you would expect them to be more arbitrary. But they are not. They follow a clear downward trajectory that looks less like symbolism and more like biological decline. Now, let me introduce you to a really uncomfortable parallel. Open a Bible and read Genesis chapter 5. It is called the genealogy of Adam, and it lists the patriarchs from Adam to Noah, along with their lifespans. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Enosh lived 905 years. Kenan lived 910 years. The pattern continues with lifespans hovering around 900 years until you get to Noah, who lived 950 years. Then comes the flood, and after the flood, lifespans plummet. Noah's son Shem lived 600 years. 5 generations later, Peleg lived only 239 years. By the time you get to Abraham, lifespans are down to 175 years. Moses lived 120 years. By the time we reach King David, we are at 70 years, which is considered a full human lifespan even today. This is the exact same pattern as the Sumerian king list. Extremely long lifespans before a great flood, gradually decreasing lifespans after the flood, eventually settling at normal human range. The biblical account even includes the same key event separating the two eras, a global deluge that reset humanity. These are not vague similarities. These are parallel historical frameworks from two different cultures describing the same phenomenon. And it is not just Sumer and the Bible. Ancient Egyptian king lists include the reigns of gods and demigods before human pharaohs took over. The reigns of these divine rulers are recorded in periods called Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, and they extend back tens of thousands of years. Hindu texts describe kings of previous ages, called Yugas, who lived for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks recorded similar traditions. Chinese mythology includes emperors who ruled for enormous periods in the distant past. Every major ancient civilization has this same basic story. There was an earlier age when rulers lived far longer than modern humans. These rulers were either gods, demigods, or humans with divine blood. After some great catastrophe, usually a flood, the long lifespans ended and humanity reset with shorter lives. Why would completely independent cultures on different continents all create the same fictional narrative? That is a pretty big coincidence. One theory that attempts to reconcile this is the genetic degradation hypothesis. If the Anunnaki really did create humans by mixing their genetics with terrestrial primates, the first-generation hybrids would have a higher percentage of Anunnaki DNA. As generations passed and humans interbred, that percentage would decrease. If Anunnaki genetics included traits for longevity, cellular repair, or slower aging, you would expect these traits to weaken over time as the genetic contribution became more diluted. Eventually, after enough generations, humans would settle into their baseline terrestrial genetics with normal 70 to 80-year lifespans. This explains the king list perfectly. The earliest kings had strong Anunnaki genetics, living for thousands or tens of thousands of years. Their descendants had weaker Anunnaki traits, living only hundreds or thousands of years. Eventually, the genetic contribution faded almost entirely, and lifespans normalized. It is actually a pretty elegant explanation if you accept the premise that the Anunnaki were real. Of course, there are other theories. Some researchers propose that ancient cultures used different time measurement systems. Perhaps what they called a year was actually a month or a season. If you convert the numbers using different calendar systems, the reigns become more reasonable. Except this creates new problems. The later kings on the list are historically verified through archaeological evidence. We know their actual reign lengths, and the king list records these correctly using the same time units as the earlier impossible reigns. So the calendar system does not change. Only the lifespan numbers change. Another possibility is that these early entries refer to something other than individual human rulers. Perhaps they represent city-states, tribal leaders, or political movements that lasted for extended periods. But again, the text does not support this interpretation. It names individuals, gives them specific titles, places them in specific cities, and treats them exactly like the later verified historical kings. Here is what really bothers historians about the king list. The later portion is accurate. After about 2500 BC, the document can be cross-referenced with archaeological evidence, and it checks out. The kings listed actually existed. Their reign lengths are correct. The cities mentioned are real. The chronology aligns with other historical sources. So we have a document that is partly fantasy and partly legitimate history, with no clear transition point between the two. It just gradually shifts from impossible to possible to verified, as if the compiler saw no difference between the ancient kings and the recent ones. They were all just history. If we dismiss the early kings as mythology, we have to explain why the Sumerians mixed obvious fiction with careful historical record in the same document using the same format. That is not how ancient people normally handled history versus mythology. They kept those separate. Myths were told in epic poetry with clearly supernatural events. History was recorded in chronicles and king lists. The Sumerian king list refuses to follow this pattern. It presents everything as history. So we are left with a document that claims human rulers once lived for tens of thousands of years, that their lifespans gradually decreased over time, and that this pattern reset after a great flood. We can dismiss it as mythology. We can explain it as symbolic or dynastic. Or we can take it at face value and ask the really disturbing question. What if they were telling the truth? What if the early kings really did live that long? What if human biology was different in the distant past? And if so, what changed? Was it natural genetic drift? Or was it something more deliberate? Did someone decide that humans were living too long and needed their lifespans reduced? The Sumerian text suggests the Anunnaki made exactly that decision. After the flood, after humanity nearly went extinct, the gods decreed that human lifespans would be shortened, not as punishment, but as control. A species that lives for only 70 years is far easier to manage than one that lives for hundreds or thousands. Less time to accumulate knowledge, less time to organize resistance, less time to question authority, just enough time to work, reproduce, and die. If you wanted to create an efficient worker species, limiting their lifespan would be a logical design choice, and the king list suggests that is exactly what happened. Imagine trying to compress an entire library of information into an object the size of your thumb. That is essentially what Sumerian cylinder seals accomplished. These small stone cylinders, typically 2 to 3 inches long, were carved with intricate scenes and then rolled across wet clay to create impressions. They served as signatures, as identification, as official stamps on documents and containers. But when you actually look at what is carved into these seals, you start to realize they might have been something more, something like a backup drive for knowledge that needed to survive. The craftsmanship alone is mind-bending. We are talking about miniature artworks carved into hard stone with detail so fine that some elements are barely visible without magnification. Figures with elaborate clothing, complex architectural backgrounds, astronomical symbols, mythological scenes, all compressed into a space smaller than a business card. The level of skill required to carve these seals is on par with Renaissance master engravers, yet they were being mass-produced in ancient Sumer. Thousands of them have been found, which means this was not rare, specialized work. This was standard technology. But forget the artistry for a moment. Look at the content. Many cylinder seals show scenes that make absolutely no sense if you approach them as simple decorative art. Figures wearing what appear to be wristwatches, beings with wings that might be flight apparatus rather than supernatural attributes, objects that look disturbingly like modern technology, filtered through ancient artistic conventions, and in some cases, astronomical diagrams that seem to encode specific information about our solar system. The most controversial cylinder seal in existence is catalogue number VA243, housed in the Berlin Museum. At first glance, it shows a typical Sumerian scene, seated figures, possibly deities, with various symbols around them. But in the upper left corner, there is something unusual. A star symbol surrounded by what appear to be 11 spherical objects of varying sizes, arranged in a specific pattern. To most archaeologists, this is just decorative space filling. To researchers like Zechariah Sitchin, this is a diagram of our solar system, including all the planets, even the ones we did not discover until the modern era. The debate over VA 243 has raged for decades. Mainstream scholars point out that interpreting ancient art is subjective, that we risk seeing what we want to see rather than what is actually there. They argue that Sumerian artists were not creating technical diagrams. They were depicting religious or mythological concepts using symbolic language. The dots could represent anything: stars in a constellation, gods in a hierarchy, decorative elements with no specific meaning. But the alternative interpretation is hard to dismiss entirely. If you map the sizes and positions of those spheres onto our actual solar system, they fit remarkably well. The central star surrounded by planetary bodies in proportional sizes. A large outer planet in an elliptical orbit that could represent the mysterious Nibiru mentioned in texts. The placement of inner and outer planets roughly corresponding to actual orbital positions. Either this is an extraordinary coincidence, or the Sumerians were depicting something they actually knew. What makes this even stranger is that this exact same type of astronomical encoding appears on other cylinder seals, not just VA 243. Multiple seals from different time periods and different cities show similar star symbols with surrounding spheres. This suggests it was not a one-time artistic choice, but rather a repeated iconographic pattern. When ancient people repeat specific symbols across time and geography, those symbols usually mean something. They are not random decoration. They are information. Cylinder seals also frequently depict what researchers call the sacred tree, or tree of life. This symbol appears in Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian seals across thousands of years. It is always shown with the same basic structure, a central trunk with symmetrical branches, often with figures on either side performing rituals or receiving something from the tree. Mainstream interpretation says this represents spiritual concepts, the connection between earth and heaven, the source of life and wisdom. But look closer at the details. Some versions of this tree have what look like technical components, nodes along the branches that resemble circuitry, connecting lines that look like wiring, root structures that appear more mechanical than organic. It is entirely possible this is just artistic stylization. But it is also possible that the Tree of Life was a technological metaphor, a way of depicting something advanced using the natural imagery available to ancient artists, knowledge networks, communication systems, perhaps even biological or genetic manipulation represented symbolically as a tree that grants life and wisdom. Then there are the seals depicting the Anunnaki themselves. And this is where things get really interesting. These beings are consistently shown as distinct from humans. They are taller, their proportions are different, their clothing is elaborate, and unlike typical Sumerian dress, they frequently carry objects, staffs with spherical tops, cone-shaped instruments, handheld devices of unclear purpose, and almost always, that mysterious handbag we discussed earlier. One seal shows an Anunnaki figure apparently instructing a human, gesturing toward astronomical symbols. Another depicts what looks like a laboratory or medical setting, with a reclining figure surrounded by attendants and strange apparatus. Another shows beings descending from the sky in what could be interpreted as vehicles or merely symbolic clouds. The question is always the same. Are we looking at mythology, or are we looking at historical records encoded in symbolic visual language? Ancient cultures worldwide used art to preserve information. Egyptian hieroglyphs are both writing and pictures. Mayan codices encode astronomical and mathematical data. Aboriginal Australian rock art contains navigational and seasonal information. Art was not just decoration, it was data storage. In a world without computers or books, encoding information into durable stone objects makes perfect sense. Cylinder seals were ideal for this purpose. Small enough to transport easily, hard enough to survive millennia. common enough that multiple copies existed as backups. If you wanted to preserve knowledge through a potential catastrophe, how would you do it? You would encode essential information into durable formats. You would create multiple copies. You would use symbolic language that could be decoded by future civilizations with sufficient knowledge. You would embed astronomical data, mathematical principles, historical records, and technological concepts into art that would be valued and preserved. And that is exactly what cylinder seals look like when you stop assuming they are purely decorative. The Sumerian seals are not unique in this regard. Similar information encoding appears in Egyptian reliefs, Mayan stelae, Hindu temple carvings. Advanced information hidden in plain sight, disguised as religious art, waiting for humanity to reach a level of knowledge where we could recognize what we were looking at. The technology to decode these messages did not exist until recently. But now we have computers that can analyze patterns, archaeological databases that allow cross-cultural comparison, astronomical software that can reconstruct ancient skies. We are finally equipped to see what might have been there all along. VA-243 sits in a glass case in Berlin, looking like a simple ancient artifact. But what if it is more than that? What if it is a message? A snapshot of knowledge encoded 4,000 years ago by people who knew far more than we have given them credit for. The seal is not going to suddenly reveal its secrets. It has been saying the same thing for millennia. The only variable is whether we are finally ready to understand what we are looking at. And the more we learn about astronomy, the more that cylinder seal starts to look less like ancient mythology and more like ancient science. Stand in the ruins of Eridu today, and you are looking at a pile of sand and broken mud brick in the middle of the Iraqi desert. It does not look like much, but according to every Sumerian text, every king list, every religious document, this place is where everything began. Not just Sumerian civilization, everything. Kingship descended from heaven here. The first city was built here. The first temple was raised here. Eridu was not just important to the Sumerians, it was sacred in a way that transcends normal religious reverence. This was ground zero. The Sumerian king list opens with a single line that has haunted archaeologists for over a century. When kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not established, not founded, lowered, as if kingship was a physical object, or perhaps a set of instructions that came from somewhere else and was delivered to this specific location. The phrasing is deliberate and repeated across multiple texts. Something came down from above and landed at Eridu. When archaeologists finally excavated Eridu in the 1940s and 50s, they expected to find evidence of gradual settlement development, a few primitive huts eventually growing into a village, then a town, then a city. That is how settlements work. But Eridu broke the pattern. The lowest levels show sophisticated architecture immediately. The first temple, built around 5300 BC, is already a complex structure with a central sanctuary, offering tables, and a platform that suggests astronomical observation. There is no prototype, no earlier, simpler version, just a fully realized temple complex appearing in the archaeological record, like someone placed it there whole. And here is the really strange part. That first temple was built, used for a period, then deliberately buried under clean sand, and a new temple built directly on top of it. Then that temple was buried, and another built on top. This happened 18 times. 18 successive temples, each one built directly over the previous one, each one slightly larger and more elaborate, spanning over 3,000 years. This was not normal urban development where old buildings get torn down and replaced. These temples were being carefully preserved beneath each new iteration, as if the exact location mattered more than anything else, as if something beneath the ground made this spot irreplaceable. The Sumerians had a name for what was under Eridu. They called it the ABZU, sometimes written as ABZU. Mainstream translation renders this as freshwater ocean or underground aquifer. And there is definitely water involved because ancient texts describe the ABZU as a place of sweet water, a subterranean ocean beneath the Earth's surface. But the ABZU was more than just a water source. It was described as the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom and creation. It was where sacred knowledge was stored. It was the foundation of the world itself. Enki's temple at Eridu was called the ABZU, which translates roughly as House of the Cosmic Waters or Temple of the ABZU. Texts describe this temple as having chambers that extended deep underground, down into the ABZU itself. Enki was said to reside in these underground chambers, surrounded by his sacred knowledge, his mez, the fundamental principles that governed reality. Priests would descend into the depths to consult with Enki, or to access knowledge stored in the ABZU. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Recent archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar have revealed massive underground water systems beneath Eridu and the surrounding region. Not just natural aquifers, but what appear to be constructed chambers and channels. The scans show anomalies that look like deliberate architecture deep below the surface. Rooms, passages, structures that do not match natural geological formations. Nobody has excavated these yet, because the site is in a politically unstable region, and funding for Mesopotamian archaeology is limited. But the data suggests there is something down there. Multiple ancient texts reference the ABZU as a place where knowledge was preserved. The Epic of Eridu describes it as containing the secrets of creation. The Enki and Ninhursag myth mentions tablets of destiny stored in the depths. The Atrahasis epic describes the ABZU as the source of civilization itself, where the plans for humanity were formed. Over and over, Sumerian literature treats the ABZU not as a metaphor, but as a physical location where tangible information was kept. What if the ABZU was not just a sacred underground water source, but an actual repository? A vault, a library, a data storage facility built by the Anunnaki to preserve knowledge through the ages. Think about where you would build such a facility. You would want it underground for protection from surface catastrophes. You would want it near water for cooling and power generation. You would want it in a geologically stable location. And you would mark its position with structures on the surface so future generations could find it again. A temple complex rebuilt 18 times in exactly the same spot is a pretty good marker. The concept of underground knowledge vaults appears worldwide in ancient traditions. The Egyptians spoke of the Hall of Records beneath the Sphinx. Hindu texts describe chambers beneath sacred mountains containing ancient wisdom. Tibetan Buddhism references hidden treasuries of knowledge in underground cities. Native American legends tell of previous civilizations that went underground to escape catastrophe. The theme is universal: advanced knowledge stored beneath the earth, waiting to be rediscovered. Enki himself is a fascinating figure when you examine his role in Sumerian mythology. He is consistently portrayed as humanity's advocate among the gods. When Enlil wanted to wipe out humanity with the flood, Enki secretly warned Ziusudra and saved the human race. When the Anunnaki debated whether to give humans knowledge, Enki argued in favor of human advancement. He was the one who taught humanity agriculture, mathematics, writing, astronomy. He gave us the tools of civilization against the wishes of other gods who wanted to keep humanity ignorant and subservient. This creates an interesting parallel to later myths. The serpent in the Garden of Eden who offers knowledge from the tree. Prometheus in Greek mythology who steals fire from the gods and gives it to humans. Lucifer, whose name literally means light-bringer, associated with forbidden knowledge. Different cultures, different names, but the same archetypal story. A benefactor figure who defies divine authority to give humanity knowledge and enlightenment, often at great personal cost. Enki was depicted as associated with serpents. His symbol was intertwined snakes, almost identical to the medical caduceus we still use today. Serpents in ancient iconography often represented wisdom, knowledge, and transformation. Was Enki the original inspiration for all these later myths about serpent figures bringing knowledge to humanity? And if so, was he mythological or historical? The ABZU is described in some texts as having a specific entrance, a gateway that could be sealed. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions Gilgamesh attempting to reach the ABZU to gain immortality, suggesting it was a real place one could physically travel to. Other texts describe rituals performed at the entrance to the ABZU, offerings made to Enki in his underground domain. These are not vague spiritual references. These are descriptions of people going to a specific location and performing specific actions. So what is actually down there beneath Eridu? Without extensive excavation, We cannot know for certain. Maybe it is just natural caverns and aquifers that the Sumerians mythologized. Maybe the underground anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar are geological flukes or much later constructions. Or maybe there really is something down there. Chambers built thousands of years ago, possibly containing artifacts, records, technology that has been sealed away for millennia. The Iraqi government has occasionally discussed plans to properly excavate ERIDU and explore the underground structures, but political instability and lack of funding have prevented serious work, which means one of the most important archaeological sites in human history sits largely unexplored, its secrets still buried under sand and time. The ABZU remains hidden, just as it has been for thousands of years, waiting beneath the ruins of the world's first city. Enki supposedly placed his knowledge in the ABZU for safekeeping, protecting it from those who would destroy it or misuse it. If that story has any basis in reality, then somewhere beneath ERIDU there might be answers to questions we have been asking for centuries. How did the Sumerians know so much? Where did their knowledge come from? Who were the Anunnaki? What technology did they possess? The Sumerians themselves said the answers were in the ABZU, in the depths beneath the first city, in the underground chambers where Enki stored the secrets of creation. They told us exactly where to look. We just have not looked yet. Open any biology textbook and look at the chart showing human evolution. You will see a neat progression. Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens. A smooth line of development spanning millions of years. Gradual changes. Slow improvements. Natural selection doing its work. Except when you actually examine the details, that smooth line has some very awkward gaps. Places where something happened that does not quite fit the gradual evolution model. And the Sumerian creation texts offer an explanation that most scientists refuse to even consider. The Atrahasis epic does not describe humanity evolving naturally. It describes us being manufactured. Let me read you the relevant section again, but this time pay attention to how specific it gets. Let the birth goddess create offspring, and let man bear the load of the gods. They called up the goddess, the midwife of the gods. Wise mummy, you are the birth goddess. Create workers. Create a worker to bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke assigned by Enlil. Let man carry the load of the gods. The goddess Ninhursag, also called Nintu or Mami, responds that she needs help from Enki, the god of wisdom. Together they devise a plan. Let them slaughter one god, and let the gods be purified by immersion. With his flesh and blood, let Nintu mix clay, that God and man may be thoroughly mixed in the clay. From the flesh of the god, let a spirit remain. Let it make the living know its sign. In case he forgets, let the spirit remain. This is not poetic metaphor. This is a recipe. Take biological matter from an existing being, the god who is slaughtered. Mix it with clay, which in context means earthly material, terrestrial biology. Combine them to create something new, a hybrid, part god, part earth creature, and make sure some aspect of the divine, some genetic marker, remains detectable so the creation never forgets its origin. Now fast forward to 1953. Watson and Crick discover the structure of DNA. We learn that all biological life is encoded in genetic sequences. We discover that genes can be transferred between organisms, that you can take genetic material from one species and insert it into another. By the 21st century, we are doing exactly what the Sumerian texts describe. We are mixing genetic material from different organisms to create new forms of life. We call it genetic engineering. The Sumerians called it creating workers to bear the load of the gods. The terminology the ancient texts use is disturbingly similar to modern genetic engineering language. They talk about mixing essences, about combining blood, which we now know carries DNA, about creating something that is partially one thing and partially another, about ensuring specific traits are passed on, about mass-producing the creation through birth goddesses, which sounds a lot like cloning or artificial wombs. Replace the word God with advanced being, and replace clay with terrestrial primate DNA, and you have a description of genetic manipulation that would not be out of place in a modern biotech lab. Human chromosome 2 is one of the biggest anomalies in our genome. Every other great ape has 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have 23 pairs. Where did our missing pair go? It did not go anywhere. It fused. Chromosome 2 is actually two smaller chromosomes that merged together at some point in our evolutionary history. The evidence is clear. We can see the remnants of the centromeres, the telomeres in the middle of the chromosome where the fusion happened. This fusion is unique to humans. It happened after we split from chimpanzees, but before modern humans emerged. Why would natural selection favor a chromosome fusion? It should not. Fusions like this usually cause serious developmental problems. They are normally evolutionary dead ends. Yet somehow, this particular fusion not only survived, but became fixed in the entire human population. Every human on Earth has this fused chromosome. That is unusual. It suggests either an extremely tight population bottleneck or something more deliberate, something that ensured this specific genetic change propagated through the entire species. Then there is the brain size issue. Human brain volume tripled over a period of about 2 million years. That is fast, extremely fast by evolutionary standards. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive. It requires huge amounts of energy. Building and maintaining a large brain is a significant survival cost. Natural selection would only favor this if the cognitive benefits dramatically outweighed the costs. But here is the thing. For most of that 2 million years, we have no evidence that early humans were doing anything that required such massive brains. No complex tools, no art, no agriculture, no advanced social structures. Just basic survival activities that other primates manage fine, with much smaller brains. So why did our brains grow so fast, if we were not using the extra capacity? One possibility is that the brain expansion happened first, and the utilization came later. But that is backward from how evolution normally works. Natural selection does not give you capabilities you might need someday. It selects for traits that provide immediate survival advantage, unless, of course, the brain expansion was not naturally selected. Unless it was designed that way by someone who knew we would need that capacity eventually. The human larynx is another oddity. We have a descended larynx that gives us fine vocal control but also means we can choke on our food, something other primates do not deal with. We traded safe eating for complex speech capability. Why? Speech is great for communication, but plenty of species communicate effectively without the anatomical modifications we have. Our version of speech seems almost over-engineered, as if someone specifically designed us for complex language, rather than letting communication systems evolve naturally. We have less body hair than any other primate. We have subcutaneous fat distribution similar to aquatic mammals. We can consciously control our breathing in ways other land mammals cannot. We have an unusually strong diving reflex for a terrestrial species. Some researchers have proposed the aquatic ape hypothesis to explain these traits, suggesting humans spent a period adapting to semi-aquatic environments. But there is no archaeological evidence for such a period, and the hypothesis has been largely rejected. Yet the traits remain unexplained. The Sumerian texts claim that creating humans required multiple attempts. Early versions were failures. Some could not reproduce. Some had defects. Eventually, the process was perfected, and the successful version was mass-produced. Does this sound familiar? Because this is exactly how genetic engineering works in modern labs. You do not get it right the first time. You create prototypes, test them, refine the process, and eventually produce a viable, stable version. In 1997, scientists successfully cloned a sheep named Dolly. Since then, we have cloned cattle, pigs, cats, dogs, horses. The process is becoming routine. We have edited human embryos using CRISPR technology, modifying their genetic code to remove disease markers. We are currently debating the ethics of designer babies, where parents could select traits for their children. Intelligence, height, eye color, disease resistance. We are on the verge of being able to create custom humans in laboratories. The technology to do what the Sumerian texts describe is no longer science fiction. We can do it right now. We have the tools. We understand the principles. We know how to mix genetic material from different species. We know how to edit genomes. We know how to clone. The only thing stopping us from creating hybrid species or dramatically modified humans is ethics and law, not capability. So if we can do this now with just 70 years of genetic research, what could a civilization do with 1,000 years of research? 10,000 years? 1,000,000 years? If the Anunnaki were real, if they were a spacefaring species with advanced biotechnology, creating a hybrid worker species by mixing their genetics with terrestrial primates would be completely feasible. Not magical, not supernatural, just advanced applied biology. The Sumerian texts say this happened roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago based on the chronologies provided. Modern anthropology dates the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens to roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. The timeline matches. The location matches. Ancient Mesopotamia and East Africa are not far apart. The description matches. A sudden appearance of a new human variant with capabilities far exceeding previous hominids. We have the missing links problem in human evolution. Fossils that should exist to show smooth transitions but do not. We have the rapid brain expansion problem. We have the chromosome fusion problem. We have anatomical quirks that do not fit standard evolutionary explanations. And we have ancient texts from the world's first civilization explicitly stating that humans were genetically engineered by advanced beings who needed workers. I am not saying this is definitely what happened. I am saying the evidence is weird enough that we should not immediately dismiss what the Sumerians themselves claimed. They said we were created through biological manipulation. They described the process in surprising detail. They explained why it was done, who did it, and approximately when. And when we examine modern human genetics, we find anomalies that fit surprisingly well with an intervention hypothesis. The scientific establishment will tell you this is pseudoscience, that ancient astronaut theories are fringe nonsense with no credible evidence. And maybe they are right. Maybe the genetic anomalies have conventional explanations we just have not figured out yet. Maybe the Sumerian creation myths are purely symbolic. Or maybe, just maybe, they were describing something real, something that actually happened. Something that would explain why the first civilization on Earth seemed to know so much about genetics, biology, and the creation of life. Because they were not inventing mythology, they were recording history. Water, rising water, water covering everything, water erasing the world. This story appears in over 500 cultures across every inhabited continent on Earth, from Mesopotamia to Greece, from India to China, from Australia to the Americas. Completely isolated cultures with no contact, no shared language, no common mythology, all telling the exact same story. A great flood destroyed the world. A chosen few were warned. They built a boat. They survived. Humanity started over. Why would everyone invent the same catastrophe? The Epic of Gilgamesh contains the oldest written version we have, but even that is based on earlier Sumerian sources. In the story, Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood. Utnapishtim describes how the god Ea, another name for Enki, came to him in secret and warned him that Enlil had decided to wipe out humanity. The gods were upset. Humans had become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. So Enlil convinced the council to send a flood to erase them all and start fresh. But Enki disagreed. He could not directly defy the council's decision, so he found a loophole. He whispered the warning to the walls of Utnapishtim's reed house, knowing the man would overhear. He told him to tear down his house, abandon his possessions, and build a boat. Not just any boat. The instructions were incredibly specific. The boat had to be a perfect cube, 120 cubits on each side, with 6 decks divided into 9 compartments. It had to be sealed with bitumen inside and out to make it waterproof. And Utnapishtim had to bring aboard his family, his craftsmen, animals of every kind, and seeds of all living things. Sound familiar? Because this is the Noah story, written down over 1,000 years before Genesis. Same plot, same instructions, same divine warning, same salvation through a boat, same restart of humanity afterward. The details are so similar that most scholars agree Genesis borrowed directly from Mesopotamian sources, probably during the Babylonian exile, when Jewish scribes would have had access to these older texts. But the flood story goes back even further than Gilgamesh. The Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, which predates Gilgamesh by centuries, tells the same story with the same structure, and this version explicitly states that the flood was meant to destroy the evidence of what the Anunnaki had been doing on Earth. It was not just about reducing human population, it was about erasing their presence, their genetic experiments, their hybrid creations, a reset button. Now, 500 cultures telling the same story could be coincidence. Humans live near water. Floods happen. Maybe every culture independently created flood myths based on local disasters. That would be the rational explanation if not for one problem. These are not local flood stories. They are specifically global flood stories. Water covering the mountains. Water covering everything. The entire world submerged. That is not a river overflowing its banks. That is describing something planetary in scale. Geologists have found evidence for massive flooding events throughout history, but nothing truly global in the time frame of human civilization. However, there are some very interesting candidates. Around 12,800 years ago, something catastrophic happened to Earth's climate. The planet was warming up, coming out of the last ice age, when suddenly temperatures plummeted again. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and it represents one of the most dramatic climate reversals in geological history. What caused the Younger Dryas? The leading theory involves the collapse of massive ice sheets covering North America. As these ice sheets melted, they created enormous freshwater lakes. At some point, the ice dams holding these lakes back failed catastrophically. Trillions of gallons of fresh water poured into the North Atlantic Ocean in a geological instant. This disrupted ocean currents, particularly the Gulf Stream, triggering rapid cooling. But it also would have caused sea levels to rise dramatically and rapidly. Coastal areas worldwide would have flooded. Civilizations living near shorelines would have been wiped out. But there is another theory that is gaining traction. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that Earth was hit by fragments of a disintegrating comet around 12,800 years ago. Multiple impact sites, massive explosions, widespread fires, rapid melting of ice sheets from the heat, atmospheric changes that blocked sunlight. A perfect storm of catastrophes that would feel, to anyone living through it, like the gods were actively trying to destroy the world. Evidence for these impacts exists. A thin layer of sediment dated to exactly this period contains high levels of platinum, iridium, and nanodiamonds, materials associated with extraterrestrial impacts. This layer appears across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. There are also widespread signs of massive wildfires from the same period. Megafauna extinctions coincide with this time frame. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, all gone within a geological instant. And here is where it gets interesting for our purposes. Göbekli Tepe, in Turkey, arguably the most mysterious archaeological site on Earth, was built around 9600 BC, that is just 2,000 years after the Younger Dryas event. The level of sophistication at Göbekli Tepe suggests the builders were not primitive hunter-gatherers slowly figuring out agriculture. They were organized, skilled, and working from existing knowledge. Some researchers propose that Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors of a pre-Younger Dryas civilization, people who had advanced knowledge and were trying to preserve it after their world was destroyed. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis offers another mechanism. Geologists have found evidence that around 5600 BC, the Mediterranean Sea catastrophically breached into what was then a lower freshwater lake, creating the Black Sea. The water level rose hundreds of feet. Shoreline settlements would have been inundated within days. This event occurred in the exact region where Sumerian civilization would later emerge. If Sumerian culture was descended from Black Sea refugees, their flood mythology would be based on a very real, very traumatic event their ancestors survived. But regardless of which mechanism was responsible, the key point is this. The flood myths are not random fairy tales. They correlate with real geological catastrophes. And these catastrophes occurred during the critical period when human civilization was either just beginning or, according to alternative theories, being forced to rebuild after a previous advanced culture was destroyed. The Sumerian texts claim that before the flood, there were cities, civilization, and the Anunnaki openly living among humans. After the flood, the world had to start over. The Anunnaki retreated, becoming less directly involved. Humanity was allowed to continue, but under new rules: shorter lifespans, limited knowledge, less direct contact with the gods. The flood was not just a natural disaster, it was a strategic reset. Graham Hancock has spent decades researching what he calls a lost civilization. His hypothesis is that an advanced human culture existed during the last ice age, possibly dating back 15,000 years or more. This civilization understood astronomy, engineering, and navigation. They built monuments and cities in coastal areas that are now underwater due to post-ice age sea level rise. When the Younger Dryas catastrophe struck, their civilization was destroyed. But survivors spread across the world, bringing their knowledge to different regions. These survivors became the gods and culture heroes remembered in mythology: Osiris in Egypt, Viracocha in Peru, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, the Anunnaki in Sumer. This would explain why so many ancient cultures have flood myths, because they all descend from survivors who witnessed the same global catastrophe. It would explain why ancient sites worldwide show similar architectural techniques and astronomical knowledge, because they were all influenced by the same source culture. And it would explain why civilization seems to appear suddenly in multiple locations around the same time period after the floods receded. Not because humans independently invented civilization 5 or 6 times, but because survivors of the earlier culture seeded the knowledge in different regions. Is this what actually happened? The evidence is circumstantial but mounting. We keep finding older and more sophisticated sites that push back the timeline of human advancement. We keep discovering underwater structures off coastlines worldwide that suggest habitation during periods when those areas were above sea level. We keep finding evidence of catastrophic flooding events that match the timing in the myths. And we keep running into cultures like the Sumerians who appear suddenly with knowledge they should not have, insisting that their knowledge came from survivors of an earlier age when the gods walked the earth. The flood legends tell us something important. They tell us that humanity has been through this before. Civilization rose. Civilization fell. Knowledge was lost. The world reset. But somehow, some of that knowledge survived, carried by individuals or groups who made it through the catastrophe, passed down through generations, eventually manifesting in places like Sumer as a sudden explosion of advanced understanding. The Sumerians themselves said this explicitly. They were not the first. They were the inheritors, the ones who remembered, the ones who rebuilt using blueprints from before the flood. And if they were telling the truth, then we need to start asking harder questions about what really happened 12,000 years ago, what was lost, and how much of what we call the beginning of civilization was actually a recovery of something much older. Learning a language is hard. Creating one from scratch is nearly impossible. Yet that is exactly what we are supposed to believe happened in Sumer. Around 3200 BC, writing simply appeared, not crude scratches representing basic concepts. Full written language capable of expressing complex abstract thoughts, legal terminology, mathematical notation, and poetic narrative, all at once, with no warm-up period. The standard story goes that Sumerian writing evolved from simple accounting tokens. Merchants needed to track goods, so they developed symbols representing commodities. Over time, these symbols became more abstract and eventually transformed into cuneiform script. That progression makes logical sense, except for one glaring problem. When we actually look at the earliest examples of Sumerian writing, they are not simple. They are already sophisticated. The Uruk period texts, our oldest examples of writing, include administrative records, yes, but they also include complex grammatical structures, verbs with tense markers, and abstract concepts. This is not one sheep, two sheep level communication. These are documents that assume the reader understands syntax, grammar, and symbolic representation. The learning curve from no writing to this level of literacy should take centuries. In Sumer, it seems to have taken decades at most. And then there is the language itself. Sumerian is what linguists call an isolate. It has no known relatives. Every other language on Earth can be traced to some family tree. Indo-European languages like English, Spanish, Hindi, and Russian all descend from a common ancestor. Semitic languages like Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic share clear connections. Sino-Tibetan languages form their own family, but Sumerian? It stands alone. It has no parent, no siblings, no cousins. It just exists, fully formed, with complex grammar and extensive vocabulary, appearing in the historical record like it materialized from nowhere. This is linguistically bizarre. Languages do not spawn in isolation. They evolve from earlier languages. They borrow from neighbors. They show clear developmental histories. When you study any language deeply, you can trace its roots backward through time, watching how words changed, how grammar simplified or complexified, how outside influences shaped its development. With Sumerian, that trail goes cold almost immediately. We have Sumerian as it was written down around 3000 BC, and before that, nothing. No Proto-Sumerian, no earlier, simpler version. Just absence. Then suddenly full complexity. The grammar is particularly interesting. Sumerian is agglutinative, meaning it builds words by stringing together morphemes, small units of meaning. A single Sumerian word can express what takes an entire sentence in English. This is not primitive communication. This is elegant, efficient linguistic engineering that requires deep understanding of how language functions at a structural level. It feels designed rather than evolved. Cuneiform script itself presents similar mysteries. The writing system uses wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. The shapes are not intuitive. They are not simple pictures that gradually became abstract. From the very beginning, cuneiform was using abstract symbols that required training to read and write. You could not just look at a cuneiform tablet and figure out what it said through context. You needed education. You needed instruction from someone who already knew the system. This implies the existence of schools almost immediately. And indeed, we have archaeological evidence of Sumerian schools called edubas, tablet houses, where scribes were trained. But this raises the question, who trained the first generation of teachers? If writing appeared suddenly, who taught the first scribes how to read and write? Someone had to know the system already in order to teach it to others. Yet there is no earlier culture in the region that used writing. So where did the first teachers learn? The content of early Sumerian texts is also revealing. These are not practice exercises or crude attempts at communication. The earliest tablets include sophisticated administrative records, tracking complex economic transactions, religious texts describing elaborate mythologies, and mathematical tables demonstrating advanced calculations. This is the written output of a culture that already knows exactly what writing is for and how to use it effectively. There is no experimentation, no figuring it out as they go, just immediate, competent usage. Compare this to the development of writing in other cultures where we have better records. Egyptian hieroglyphs show clear developmental stages. Early versions are pictographic and limited. Over centuries, they become more abstract and capable of expressing complex ideas. Chinese characters similarly evolved from oracle bone script through multiple intermediate stages. We can watch these writing systems develop. With Sumerian cuneiform, that developmental period either happened impossibly fast or it happened somewhere else and was brought to Sumer fully developed. The vocabulary is equally puzzling. Early Sumerian texts include technical terminology for astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, agriculture, law, and medicine. These are specialized vocabularies that normally take generations to develop as each field becomes more sophisticated and requires more precise language. Yet Sumerian seems to have all of this terminology from the start, suggesting either that the knowledge existed before the writing, or that the writing system was created by people who already possessed advanced knowledge and needed language capable of expressing it. There is also the strange fact that Sumerian was a dead language by 1800 BC. It was replaced by Akkadian, a Semitic language, for everyday use. But Sumerian continued to be taught in scribal schools for another 1500 years as a language of scholarship and religion, much like Latin in medieval Europe. This suggests that Sumerian held special status, that it was considered the original language, the language of the gods, too important to let die, even after nobody spoke it anymore. Why would a culture preserve a dead language for over a millennium unless that language held some sacred or historical significance that went beyond mere communication? The Sumerian word for human is lulu, which translates roughly as mixed one. The word for the gods is dingir, often represented by a star symbol, suggesting beings from the sky. The language itself encodes the creation story. Humans are the mixed ones, created by the star beings. This is not accidental terminology. This is embedded cosmology, built into the structure of the language from its inception. If you wanted to give a developing civilization the tool of writing, you would not start with primitive pictographs and wait centuries for them to evolve something useful. You would give them a complete system, efficient, capable of expressing complex ideas. With built-in grammatical structures and extensive vocabulary, you would teach a core group how to use it, establish schools to spread the knowledge, and let it propagate. And when we look at Sumerian, that is exactly what it looks like. Not a language that evolved, a language that was taught. There is a stone carving at a site called Karahan Tepe in Turkey, dated to around 9500 BC. It shows a figure holding a handbag, now travels 7,000 miles west to Tula in Mexico. There, carved into stone pillars around 900 CE, are figures also holding handbags. Same object, same way of holding it, same proportion and design. These cultures were separated by 8,000 years and an entire ocean. They had no contact, no trade routes, no shared mythology that we know of. Yet they carved the exact same object being held by the exact same types of beings. Tall, important figures who appear to be gods or teachers. This is not a coincidence you can easily explain away. This is a pattern, and once you start looking for it, you find it everywhere. The handbag appears at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. It appears in Sumerian reliefs showing the Anunnaki. It appears in Assyrian palace carvings. It appears in New Zealand Maori art. It appears in ancient Olmec sculpture in Mexico. It appears in Balinese temple architecture. Always the same basic design. Always held by figures of importance. Always associated with knowledge, power, or divine authority. Mainstream archaeology struggles with this. The standard explanation is that a handbag or basket is such a simple, universal tool that every culture would naturally depict it. But that explanation falls apart when you look at the specifics. This is not just any basket or bag. It is a very particular design, rectangular with a curved handle, held in a specific manner, associated specifically with non-human or superhuman entities. If it was just about depicting a common tool, why always this exact design? Why always held by gods rather than ordinary people going about daily tasks? The pyramid connection is even more unsettling. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, step pyramids in Egypt, pyramid temples in Mesoamerica, Borobudur in Indonesia, the structures at Caral in Peru, all built during a relatively narrow window of human history, roughly between 3000 and 1000 BC, some even earlier, all using the same basic architectural principle. A massive stepped or smooth-sided pyramid serving as a connection point between earth and heaven, a place where humans could interact with the divine. The engineering knowledge required to build these structures is not simple. You need to understand load-bearing, weight distribution, foundation stability, and astronomical alignment. Most of these pyramids are precisely oriented to cardinal directions or specific celestial events. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of 1 degree. The Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan is aligned to the same precision. These cultures supposedly had no contact, yet they independently decided to build massive pyramids aligned with near-perfect accuracy to the same astronomical references. Then there are the flood myths we discussed earlier, but let me add specifics now. The Mesopotamian flood story. A god warns a man, he builds a boat, he saves his family and animals. The boat lands on a mountain, he releases birds to find land. The biblical flood story. God warns Noah, he builds an ark, saves his family and animals. The ark lands on Mount Ararat. He releases birds to find land. The Hindu flood story. Vishnu warns Manu. He builds a boat, saves sages and seeds. The boat is tied to a mountain by a great fish. The Greek flood story. Zeus sends a flood. Deucalion is warned by Prometheus. Builds a boat. Lands on Mount Parnassus. The Chinese flood story. Gun and Yu survive a great flood and become the founders of civilization. Native American tribes have flood stories. Aboriginal Australians have flood stories. Pacific Islanders have flood stories. African cultures have flood stories. These are not vague, "there was lots of water once" myths. They include specific plot points that repeat across cultures: divine warning, a chosen survivor, a boat, animals saved, landing on a mountain, restart of humanity. This level of narrative consistency across isolated cultures is not normal. It suggests either a shared source event or a shared source of information about that event. The serpent symbolism is another thread that connects everything. In Sumer, Enki is associated with serpents and is depicted with intertwined snakes. In Egypt, the Uraeus serpent represents divine authority and appears on the headdresses of pharaohs. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl is the feathered serpent god who brought knowledge and civilization. In India, the Nagas are serpent beings associated with wisdom and water. In China, dragons, which are essentially serpents, represent imperial power and cosmic knowledge. In Australia, the rainbow serpent is a creator deity. In Norse mythology, the Midgard serpent encircles the world. Why serpents? Why do cultures worldwide use snake imagery to represent wisdom, knowledge, and divine power? The common explanation is that snakes are mysterious and dangerous, so humans naturally mythologize them. But that does not explain the consistency of the association with knowledge and creation. It does not explain why serpent gods are specifically credited with teaching humanity civilization. It does not explain the symbol of intertwined serpents appearing on the staff of Hermes, the medical caduceus, the Kundalini energy in yoga, and Sumerian depictions of Enki. There is also the star knowledge problem. The Dogon tribe of Mali in Africa possess detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system, including the existence of Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star that is completely invisible to the naked eye, and was not discovered by Western astronomy until 1862. The Dogon claimed this knowledge was given to them by amphibious beings called the Nommo, who came from the Sirius system. Mainstream anthropologists argue the Dogon learned about Sirius B from Western visitors in the early 20th century, but the Dogon oral traditions describing this knowledge predate Western contact. The Polynesians navigated thousands of miles of open ocean using only star knowledge and wave patterns, reaching tiny islands with precision that seems impossible without instruments. How did they know those islands existed? How did they calculate the routes? Their oral traditions say the knowledge was given to them by gods who traveled the stars. The Nazca lines in Peru, massive geoglyphs only fully visible from the air, were created by a culture that supposedly had no flight capability. Why create art you cannot see from ground level, unless you expect someone to view it from above? The designs include perfectly straight lines running for miles across varied terrain, geometric shapes of incredible precision, and animal figures that maintain their proportions when viewed from altitude. This requires surveying knowledge and mathematical planning that seems out of place for the time period. In Egypt, the Osirayon at Abydos is built with massive megalithic blocks in a style completely unlike other Egyptian architecture. It looks more similar to Andean construction techniques at sites like Sacsayhuaman in Peru, massive polygonal stones fitted together with precision joints and no mortar. These sites are separated by an ocean and thousands of years, yet the construction technique is nearly identical. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off Greece, is a complex geared device from around 100 BC that functioned as an astronomical calculator. It could predict eclipses, track the moon's orbit, and model the irregular motion of the moon. Nothing remotely this sophisticated appears again in history until mechanical clocks in medieval Europe over 1,000 years later. Where did the knowledge to build this come from? Why was it not developed further? The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, shows the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy. Except Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, and the coastline depicted on the map appears to show Antarctica without its ice sheet, which would require the map to be based on source material from at least 6,000 years ago, before the continent was covered in ice. Piri Reis himself wrote notes on the map, indicating he compiled it from older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. Every one of these anomalies can be explained away individually. The handbags are convergent design. The pyramids are logical architecture for monument building. The flood myths are response to local disasters. The serpent symbolism is natural because snakes are mysterious. The star knowledge is coincidence or contamination from modern sources. The construction similarities are parallel development. Each explanation makes sense in isolation, but when you look at all of them together, the coincidences pile up. At some point, you have to ask whether these are really independent developments or whether something else is going on. Whether these cultures, separated by vast distances and time, were all influenced by a common source, a source that travelled, a source that taught, a source that left the same signatures everywhere it went. The Sumerians called this source the Anunnaki. The Egyptians called them the Neteru. The Mesoamericans called them Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha. The Indians called them the Devas. Different names, different languages. But when you read the descriptions, they are talking about the same thing. Beings from elsewhere who came to Earth, taught humanity the foundations of civilization, and then withdrew, leaving behind monuments, myths, and mysteries that we are only now beginning to decode. April 2003, Baghdad, the Iraq Museum. As American forces advanced into the city and government control collapsed, looters descended on one of the most important archaeological repositories in the world. Over 15,000 artifacts disappeared in 48 hours of chaos. Priceless Sumerian tablets, cylinder seals, statues, jewelry, objects that had survived for 4,000 years, stolen or destroyed in 2 days. The official narrative is straightforward. This was opportunistic looting during wartime chaos. Criminals took advantage of the breakdown in security to steal valuable antiquities for the black market. But if you dig deeper into what specifically went missing, a different picture emerges. The looters were not random. They had keys. They knew which storage rooms contained the most significant items. They bypassed the main galleries that held obvious treasures and went straight to the archives and storage areas where unexhibited materials were kept. This was not chaotic theft. This was targeted acquisition. Among the missing items were thousands of clay tablets that had never been fully translated or published. Tablets containing texts that most scholars had never seen. Storage rooms, holding artifacts that contradicted official timelines or presented information that did not fit conventional narratives. These were not the showpiece items that would fetch high prices on the black market. These were research materials, documentation, evidence. When UNESCO and archaeological teams finally assessed the damage months later, something strange became apparent. Many of the most unusual or controversial items were gone. Tablets containing astronomical data, seals depicting ambiguous technology, artifacts showing anomalous dating. Meanwhile, less significant but more valuable items made of gold or precious stones were left behind. Professional thieves would have taken the gold. These thieves took the information. Some items have since been recovered through international efforts and repatriation programs, but thousands remain missing. And the question nobody wants to ask loudly is, where did they go? Who specifically wanted access to untranslated Sumerian texts badly enough to orchestrate a targeted heist during a war? This is not the only incident of mysterious disappearance of controversial artifacts. Museum basements worldwide contain objects that are never displayed because they are too problematic. Items with dating that contradicts established chronology. Artifacts showing technology that should not exist in the claimed time period. Evidence of cultural contact between civilizations that are supposed to have had no interaction. The Baghdad battery I mentioned earlier, there are actually multiple examples. At least a dozen similar devices have been found, but most are not on display. They sit in storage, occasionally studied by researchers who publish papers that get minimal attention. Why? Because acknowledging that ancient people had electrochemical cells opens uncomfortable questions about what else they might have had. The Antikythera mechanism spent decades in storage after its discovery in 1901 because nobody could figure out what it was. When researchers finally X-rayed it in the 1970s and discovered the complex gearwork inside, it fundamentally challenged assumptions about ancient technological capability. But how many similar devices have been found and simply catalogued as metal fragments or corroded artifacts without anyone bothering to investigate further? There is a persistent rumor among researchers that the Smithsonian Institution has been quietly suppressing evidence that does not fit mainstream narratives for over a century. Giant skeletons found in North America, anomalous artifacts discovered in impossible geological layers, objects depicting advanced technology from pre-Columbian cultures. According to these accounts, when such discoveries are made, they are quietly acquired by the Smithsonian and never seen again. Now, is this an organized conspiracy to hide the truth? Probably not in the dramatic sense. What is more likely is that institutional inertia, academic gatekeeping, and career protection create an environment where controversial findings get buried through bureaucratic processes rather than intentional cover-up. A curator does not want to risk their reputation on an artifact that challenges their life's work. A researcher does not want to publish findings that will get them laughed out of their field. So problematic items get shelved, labeled as unexplained or misidentified, and forgotten. The translation of Sumerian texts is another area where information gets filtered. There are only a few hundred people in the world qualified to translate cuneiform. They form a tight academic community with shared assumptions and standards. When translations challenge orthodox interpretations, they face enormous resistance. Zechariah Sitchin's translations were dismissed not necessarily because they were incorrect, but because they led to conclusions the academic establishment found unacceptable. But here is the thing about academic consensus. It is not the same as truth. Academic consensus once said Troy was a myth until Heinrich Schliemann found it. Academic consensus said humans arrived in the Americas 13,000 years ago, until sites like Monte Verde pushed that back to at least 15,000. Academic consensus said Göbekli Tepe could not exist because hunter-gatherers did not build monumental architecture until it was excavated and dated. Consensus is just what most experts currently believe. It changes when evidence forces it to change. The problem is that evidence which contradicts consensus often does not get the funding, attention, or platform needed to force that change. A researcher proposing to study anomalous artifacts struggles to get grants. Papers suggesting alternative interpretations get rejected from journals. Careers are damaged by association with controversial theories. This creates a chilling effect where legitimate researchers avoid certain topics entirely, leaving them to amateur investigators who lack the credentials to be taken seriously. It is a perfect system for maintaining orthodoxy regardless of what the evidence actually shows. I am not claiming there is a secret cabal of archaeologists meeting in dark rooms to decide what history we are allowed to know. That is not how it works. The suppression is structural. It is cultural. It is the product of a system that rewards conformity and punishes deviation. And that system has been very effective at keeping certain questions from being asked too loudly. But here is what they cannot suppress. The tablets themselves still exist, scattered across dozens of museums and private collections. The technology exists to translate them more accurately than ever before. High-resolution imaging allows us to read damaged texts that were previously illegible. Digital databases allow researchers to cross-reference information across thousands of documents. The tools to unlock these secrets are better now than they have ever been. The question is whether anyone with the credentials and resources will have the courage to look at what is actually written on those tablets without filtering it through the lens of what they have been taught is possible. Because if even 10% of what the Sumerians claimed is literally true, then everything we think we know about human history is wrong. And that is a conclusion most academics are not prepared to accept, no matter what the evidence says. Right now, at this very moment, astronomers are scanning the outer solar system looking for something they call Planet 9, not because they have seen it, but because the math says it has to be there. Distant objects in the Kuiper belt are moving in ways that only make sense if something massive is pulling on them, something roughly 10 times the mass of Earth, orbiting far beyond Neptune in a long elliptical path. The calculations are solid. Multiple independent research teams have verified the orbital anomalies. Something is out there, and 4,000 years ago the Sumerians said exactly the same thing. They called it Nibiru, a large planetary body with an extended orbit that periodically passes through the inner solar system. For decades, astronomers dismissed this as pure mythology. Now those same astronomers are publishing papers proposing the existence of exactly what the ancient texts described. The details do not match perfectly. Planet 9's proposed orbit is much longer than the Sumerian 3,600-year cycle, but the fundamental claim that there is another significant planet in our solar system that we have not yet seen is being taken seriously by mainstream science for the first time. What else did the Sumerians know that we are only now rediscovering? What other information encoded in those clay tablets is waiting for us to develop the knowledge necessary to recognize it? We spent centuries dismissing their astronomical data as fantasy before we developed telescopes powerful enough to realize they were right. How many other claims are we dismissing now that future technology will validate? The James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, represents the most advanced astronomical observation platform ever created. It can see deeper into space and further back in time than any instrument before it. It can analyze the atmospheric composition of exoplanets. It can detect chemical signatures that might indicate biological activity, and it is currently mapping the outer solar system with unprecedented precision. If Planet 9 exists, Webb will likely find it within the next decade, and when that happens, we will have to seriously reconsider everything the Sumerians said about cosmic visitors. But the implications go far beyond astronomy. Every major technological advance we have made as a species has roots in Sumerian innovations. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, architecture, agriculture, metallurgy, medicine, the wheel, the concept of time divided into hours, minutes, and seconds. These are not minor contributions. These are the foundational technologies of civilization. Everything we have built since, all of modern society, rests on this foundation laid down in ancient Mesopotamia. And if the Sumerians were right about where this knowledge came from, if it was indeed given to them rather than developed by them, then we need to ask the most important question of all. Why? Why would advanced beings come to Earth, genetically engineer a species, teach them the basics of civilization, and then withdraw? What was the purpose? What was the project? And most importantly, is it finished? The Sumerian texts suggest the Anunnaki will return, not as a vague spiritual concept, but as a literal physical return, when conditions are right, when humanity has reached a certain level, when the cycle completes. Whether you interpret this as aliens, as time travelers, as interdimensional beings, or as metaphor for some other phenomenon, the core message is the same. This story is not over. There are people who take this very seriously. Not conspiracy theorists hiding in bunkers, but legitimate researchers, scientists, and thinkers who believe we are in a unique position in human history. We have technology the Sumerians could only dream of. We have genetic engineering capabilities that match what the texts describe the Anunnaki doing. We have space programs actively working toward becoming an interplanetary species ourselves. We are, in many ways, following the same developmental path the Sumerians said the Anunnaki followed. Some researchers believe ancient knowledge has been preserved through secret societies and esoteric traditions. That groups like the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and various mystery schools are custodians of information passed down from Sumerian priests. Whether this is true or romantic fantasy is debatable, but it is interesting that these organizations consistently use Sumerian and Egyptian symbolism and claim lineage back to ancient sources of hidden knowledge. The search for ancient astronaut evidence continues, not just through archaeology but through modern physics. The breakthrough propulsion programs studying UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, are taking seriously the possibility that we are being observed by non-human intelligence. The Pentagon has acknowledged the existence of objects displaying flight characteristics beyond our current technology. Are these related to what the Sumerians described? Are we being watched by the same entities that allegedly jump-started our civilization thousands of years ago? SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, has been scanning the cosmos for decades looking for radio signals from alien civilizations. But perhaps we have been looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps the evidence we seek is not out there in the stars, but down here in the ruins and artifacts of our own past. Perhaps the extraterrestrial contact we are searching for already happened. Perhaps it was documented extensively. Perhaps we have been reading those documents for a century and dismissing them as mythology because we could not accept what they were actually saying. The Sumerian mysteries matter because they are our mysteries. This is not ancient history that has no relevance to modern life. This is the foundation of everything we are. Our laws, our mathematics, our calendar, our writing, our cities, our entire concept of civilization began in Sumer. And if the origin story the Sumerians themselves told is even partially true, then understanding that origin becomes critical to understanding what we are, where we came from, and perhaps most importantly, where we are going. So here we are. We have examined the evidence. The impossible astronomical knowledge that required 60,000 years of observation, the sudden appearance of a fully formed civilization with no developmental period, the genetic anomalies in human DNA that suggest intervention, the king lists recording rulers who lived for thousands of years, the mathematical genius that we still use today, the technological artifacts that should not exist, the cylinder seals encoding information we are only now learning to decode, the flood legends appearing in 500 cultures worldwide, the cross-cultural connections that span oceans and millennia, and through it all, one consistent claim. The Anunnaki came from the sky, created humanity, gave us knowledge, and shaped the course of our development. Three explanations sit before us. The conventional view says the Sumerians were brilliant but entirely human, that they developed everything themselves through natural ingenuity and patience, and that their god stories are purely mythological attempts to explain their world. This requires us to accept a lot of coincidences, a lot of anomalies, a lot of knowledge appearing from nowhere, but it fits within our comfortable understanding of history. The ancient astronaut hypothesis says the Sumerians were telling the literal truth that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth, genetically engineered humans, and taught us civilization. This explains the anomalies, but requires us to accept that we have been visited by non-human intelligence and that our entire origin story needs rewriting. The lost civilization theory suggests an advanced human culture existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, that survivors of this culture seeded knowledge in various locations, including Sumer, and that what we call the first civilization was actually a recovery of much older knowledge. This splits the difference, keeping the story human while explaining the impossible sophistication. Which explanation is correct? I cannot tell you that. Nobody can, with absolute certainty based on current evidence. What I can tell you is that the conventional explanation has some serious problems. The evidence does not quite fit. The timeline does not quite work. The knowledge appears too suddenly. The connections are too consistent. Something happened in our past that we do not fully understand. Something that involved the Sumerians at its center. Something that shaped everything that came after. The tablets are still being translated. New archaeological sites are still being discovered. Technology is giving us new ways to analyze old evidence. Ground-penetrating radar might reveal what lies beneath ERIDU. The James Webb Telescope might find Planet 9. Genetic analysis might identify exactly when and how our DNA was modified. The answers are coming. The question is whether we are ready to accept what they might tell us. If you have made it this far, you are clearly someone who questions the official narrative, someone who wants to dig deeper, someone who understands that history is written by those in power and that the truth often lies buried beneath layers of accepted dogma. So keep questioning, keep researching, look at the primary sources yourself, read the translations, examine the artifacts. Do not just accept what you are told by authorities who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And if this journey through Sumerian mysteries has opened your mind to possibilities you had not considered before, Do me a favor, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, because we are just getting started. There are dozens of other ancient mysteries waiting to be explored, other civilizations with impossible knowledge, other artifacts that do not fit the timeline, other questions that mainstream archaeology refuses to answer. Honestly, this community we are building, we are the ones asking those questions. We are the ones demanding real answers. And together, we are going to keep pushing until the truth, whatever it turns out to be, finally comes to light. The Sumerians left us a message carved in stone and pressed into clay. They told us exactly where we came from and who helped us get here. For 4,000 years, that message has been sitting in museums and archives, waiting for a generation wise enough to take it seriously. Maybe we are that generation. Maybe the time has finally come to stop dismissing our ancestors as primitive myth-makers and start recognizing them as witnesses to something extraordinary, something that changed the course of human history forever, something that made us who we are today. The truth is out there. Actually, the truth is down here, buried in the sands of ancient Mesopotamia. We just have to be brave enough to dig it up and accept what we find. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next investigation.